Okay, I'm going to start again. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. We'll pretend that bit didn't happen. As I just said, this is a hybrid event, so we have people here at the iMuseum. We also have a number of people joining online. So those on Zoom, before I get going, can you please let me know you can see me and hear me okay by using the raise hand function here. Or if you've got any issues, pop some messages up. That's brilliant. That's really good for me. Thank you, because that means I know that's all working. You should be able to see some slides on the telly screen as well. Lovely. So format for this morning, we're going to be joined by Ali Lewin, and Fiona Gale is also joining us. She's also on Zoom, so that bit again, technical challenge, but we should work that out. So we've got some really good updates for you. I'm going to let Chris Gledhill do a bit of an intro for you. Chris is the chair of the Chamber of Commerce Climate Change Group, which we formed maybe 2 years ago, I think. And the idea behind that group is to work in parallel with the government's climate change transformation team as well. So I'll let Chris do anything, but for those of you online, I'm there with you. So if you have any issues, please just drop something in the chat and I will hopefully solve it for you. This session is being recorded and we will be able to share the slides after. So if you can't see the slides very well, please don't worry, we will share them afterwards. Okay, thank you. Chris?
Morning and welcome everybody online and in person. Excuse me. We've got a couple of updates this morning from the climate change team, which I'm really looking forward to seeing because there's been a lot of work going on over the summer right now. And I think as we move into a new administration and a new period here on the Isle of Man, I think this is going to be really a time where some of the things we've been talking about for a long time will start to be implemented and come into some sort of much sharper focus. So I think today's session, I think we'll have the updates and we'll get some clarity about the direction of travel. And I think we've got probably an hour or so, 50 minutes to an hour for discussion. And I think the discussion today is going to be very much in response to the real practical things we're hearing that are going to be coming forward. And given that this is a Chamber of Commerce event, excuse me, I think it's very much going to be about what are the business opportunities, real business opportunities. What do people want to know in terms of both their own personal and their businesses' investments and plans? We're going to talk a bit about funding and finance. We're going to talk a bit about the difference between a cost and an investment, because I think that gets quite confused occasionally. And particularly, I think, in that session, we want to try and tease out both the things which are obvious that we should be getting on with and perhaps investing in, and also perhaps determine what some of the questions are that we want to feed back to the climate change team, who have some really good advisors, consultants, and also internal capabilities around in terms of their economic analysis capabilities and so on. And I really like, because this is supposed to be a team effort, we're only going to achieve anything in this huge technological transition we're all trying to participate in if it's a team effort. And so, and that's part of what I think, certainly as a business person, what I'm going to be looking for from the government team is the right analysis that gives me the answers I really need to help make the right investment decisions. And I think that's true for us as a business. I think it will be true for most of the people in the audience, whether they're thinking about their own domestic circumstances and housing and emissions, or whether they're thinking about what they're doing as an organisation, as a business, as a chairman. So that's the thrust of today's meeting, I think. So without too much more blather from me, let's hand over to the experts and see where they've got to. So I think the first presentation is Ali or Fiona?
It's me.
It's Ali. So Ali, over to you.
Right, I've been instructed to talk very loudly, so I'm going to try. So good morning, my name's Ali, and I look after the delivery side of the climate change team. So it's my responsibility to make sure that we achieve all the actions that were agreed by Tim Ward in January 2020, the 60 actions in there, and they last till April 2022. At that point, our 5-year plan takes over from 2022 to 2027. And my colleague Fiona, who's with me, she looks at that part. So she's head of research and development, and I'm head of actually making sure we deliver on the first phase of the plan. Do you want to move to the next? So I'll start with our emissions. You might know this already. Anyone that likes to research things to do with climate on the Isle of Man, you'll know this, because we emit as an island 700,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. The majority of that comes from energy supply. So that's the fact that we're still very, very reliant on fossil fuels on the island. We have a combined cycle gas turbine at Four Rows, which uses imported gas, and that's the majority of the emissions in terms of the energy. We also have a couple of diesel engines, and we have two very, very small scale kind of clean energy plants, being Sulby Hydro and the Energy for Waste plant. Liz is going to talk more about this when she gets onto it, and she's the expert on compressor. Then we have transport, which is mainly from people's cars. We are an island of about 84,000 people. We'll know more when the census comes out imminently, and we have around 75,000 cars, which is huge. So transport is mainly from cars, emissions from cars. Residential is from people's hot water and heating systems. So we still have a lot of oil, gas, coal on the island, very little electric heating, and some of the work we've been doing around the renewable heating strategy, which Liz is going to talk about, will show how we're going to decarbonise that sector. Agriculture, that's mostly from land use and also, of course, animals, livestock, so cows. And then we have business that's generally quite small scale, actually, because we have no heavy industry on the island. It's mostly from refrigeration and heating. And then there's also waste management as well. It's a very small amount. So next slide, please. I'm only going to briefly talk about this because actually the exciting stuff is all like Lizzie and Fiona. So this is how the Isle of Man came to be with regards to climate action. So this is one of the slides that Rebecca said, oh, I can't see it, we'll send it to you. So obviously scientists have been talking about for 30 years. I'm not going to get into climate science. It's not for debate anymore. Then we saw a lot of public momentum with very high profile figures like Greta and David Attenborough, and that kind of pushed a real momentum in society. And brilliantly, the chief recognised the climate emergency back in 2019, and very quickly after that, we had Professor Curran come on board with an analytical team in government, and they produced the impact report, and from that, the action plan was formed. So that happened obviously January 2020, then of course COVID hit. So the team itself wasn't formed until September, October 2020. In the meantime, Fiona carried on pushing through the bill, the climate change bill, which has gone for royal assent, and we expect to receive that back by October Tynwald, and then at that point it will be in law. And we will have to make sure that we get to net zero by 2050, because that will be the legal statute. Then when I started, it's almost a year ago that I started, which is incredible. But that's when we started rolling out the phase 1 implementation. So we prioritised all the different actions to see which ones we should do first, and we realised that energy was really, really important, so we started that straight away. Then we started reaching out to the public via the Citizens Forum, and then we started working on the phase 2 plan, which is what Fiona has been working on, and we had a consultation on it over the summer. Oh, slide, please. So these are the different work streams that are in the phase 1 plans. The 60 actions, they fall across 10 work streams. So the first one is totally complete. That's the end of the programme. We've done that. Treasury very kindly gave us £10 million funding, which is fantastic. So we have half of that is for kind of revenue projects, and the other half is for capital projects. That's making government buildings cleaner. Obviously, I talked about the team being set up in 2020, and then one of the first things we did was we started to reach out across government, because this isn't a programme. We sit in Cabinet Office, but this isn't a programme that just relies on one department, it relies on all our departments. So we had to go out and find out who it was in the different departments that would be responsible for delivering the actions we need them to do. And a lot of those are the government estate managers who run the buildings where a lot of emissions come from. So we've been chatting to them about how they can access funding to make properties, reduce their emissions basically. So for example, new school buildings, the STEM Q2 blockout appeal, that's got plans for being very sustainable. And then we are also just about to implement climate impact audits across the estate as well. So each department will have a dashboard showing them what their emissions are, and then we'll work with them on how to reduce them. Kind of again, it's going to be like a wall of shame. We started looking at energy generation because obviously it's the highest portion of emissions across the island. So after a tender process, we appointed Dave Barrett. They gave us 5 future energy scenarios. Liz will talk about that when she gets to her bit. Homes, we are launching a Green Living grant in October. That's to help people decarbonise their own homes. So that will be up to £6,000. It is means tested, so if you earn more than £112,000 on Great Can't Fly. It also is eligible for homes that are under D and under. So when I talk about D, I'm talking about energy efficiencies and EPC ratings and SAT ratings. Julie will know what I'm talking about. But so as part of the grant, you'll be able to get a free Manx Home energy audit, which will tell you what rating your home is. And then you'll know if you're eligible to apply for the grant. And the grant consists of, yes, £6,000, that's up to 50% of all the measures. And you can have things like insulation, air tightness testing, low carbon boilers, solar PV. There's a range of things. If you go to greenliving.im, that will show you what the grant is. And you can also register for interest there as well. Then we have the renewable heating strategy underway. So that started May time. We've just had interim results from that. Liz is going to talk you through. Literally last week was when we got the interim results from that. Nature-based sequestration opportunities. This is where we have carbon sinks. So we have to use our land to kind of sequester as much carbon as possible. And we work really closely with DECA on this. And obviously we've got the trees, the People's Forest, which the Chief Minister opened, I think, officially about a week ago on a very misty day. We started peat restoration work, which I personally found really interesting because I didn't realise peat was so important in this whole carbon journey. So we started the first 1,000 acres of peat restoration. It stopped over the summer because there's nesting birds on the uplands. It'll start again towards the winter. DEFRA announced the Woodland Grant Scheme. So that's a scheme that encourages people to plant trees for non-farmers. We started work on something called the LUCF, which is land use change in forestries. So that's looking at baseline data across all of the land use types on the island. So grassland, forest, peatland, bogs, and seeing how much that sequesters, like per acre. So we have baseline data on that. The land management plan is a huge big plan that Fiona is leading on, which will look at that in more detail, basically in the best strategy for land use across the island over the next 30 years to make sure we maximise sequestration opportunities. And the blue carbon management plan, again, Fiona's leading on that. So this is how we look at our seas and the potential of seagrass to sequester carbon in the seas. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we have transport. So we obviously, before we came along, the steam packet had already agreed to purchase a low carbon fueled vessel, I should say, vessel. And we are imminently about to start our transport decarbonisation strategy. So that's how we're going to decarbonise the basically the transport, and we move people away from using cars so much to more active travel. That went out for procurement a couple of weeks ago, but we might be going back out again shortly, as we only had one person go for it over the summer. And then we work quite closely with MUA on public charging points. So at the moment we have 47 public charging points across the island. And then we have business and industry, so we have an action to review agricultural emissions. So there's two people on my team that are doing that, working really closely with the MNFU on emissions across farms. They did a farm audit it was last year with 6 farms where they looked at what the total sequestration was versus the emissions from those farms. They want to roll that out to all the farms on the island. And we are also looking at how we can implement an offsetting scheme, which I find is a really interesting area because I think a lot of businesses on the island want to offset, and we don't actually have a local scheme whereby they can do that. And of course, if you offset locally on the island, then it does have an impact on our emissions. It does count in reducing our emissions, whereas if you offset internationally, it doesn't have any impact on our emissions. So our emissions stay the same. Public engagement and awareness. So obviously we started the Citizens Forum, that's 36 members of the public. That was last October, we're coming up to a year with the Citizens Forum. So we will shortly be doing a review to see what we do after that year. We did some insights work as well into what barriers stopped people from making action into climate change sort of mitigation efforts in their own life. And that found that they didn't know where to start. 2050 was too far away, quite costly, and I don't know where to start. I can't remember the fourth one. But basically, that gave us the insights that we needed to then start up our website. So we've been working on website content for the last few months to try and understand what it is people need to know and how they can. We're kind of focusing on all the areas they can take action. So in their homes, the way they transport, what they eat, and also how they talk about climate change and how they can raise awareness themselves with friends and family if it's something they feel quite passionate about. Over the summer, we did some pop-up and community events with regards to the 5-year plan. So Rose organised those for us, but we went around the island, we went to the Royal Agricultural Show, and we just started engaging with people. At the same time, we set up our social media channels, which was great as well, because we started to get questions and feedback about what areas that people were kind of struggling with, and that gives us great insight into, again, what to put on our website and educate the public. We did a couple of school talks as well. So Glenn and our team went out and spoke to a couple of schools in the last week of just before summer holidays broke up, and we want to do that again when they go back. And we're also working towards potentially having something COP26, although to be honest, we're not really sure. It's all quite disjointed when you talk about COP26. As far as we're aware, it's definitely going ahead. It's just whether it'll be virtual or in person. So we are working with a couple of Crown dependencies on doing some sort of joint event at COP26. What's COP26? Sorry, COP26 is Conference of the Parties, and it's a big climate change kind of discussion, like forum, there's negotiations that take place. Yeah, a lot of policies are made at the COPs. So the one that was held in Paris, where the Paris Agreement came from. So this is the 26th version of the Conference of the Parties, and it's being held in Glasgow in November, which is nice because I think it's maybe the first time it's been held in the UK. Yeah, so there's a big deal about it being held in the UK.
A lot of the really big agreements like Paris.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just that COVID is affecting attendance at that. Then the climate change bill, which Fiona was really heavily involved with, and that was pushed through really quickly to make sure that it was embedded, so that the next administration that come in, it's in place and they can't go back on anything it's been committed to. So like I say, that was sent for Royal Assent on the 2nd of June, and we're hoping it'll be in place by October. And then Fiona's working on the planning and development of secondary legislation that falls underneath that as well. You might have actually seen that the plastics consultation, single-use plastics legislation went out recently, and that falls under the bill. That was an enabler from the bill, basically. And then we're working really closely with Treasury on how we finance some of the mitigation. And to do that, we really need to await the results of the strategies, and I've got a slide in a second which looks at the strategies that we're working on. And we also need to factor in just transition across the entire piece of work that we're doing. So that's making sure that the vulnerable aren't left behind in everything that we're doing. So we've just started working on that and identifying who those vulnerable are, what pressures they face, and how we can make sure we include them in what we're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we started in the team, we had a big brainstorm. We realised there were 5 key strategies we needed to do to outline the roadmap of how we were going to get to net zero by 2050. So of course, the first one was energy, because we have a quick commitment to 75% renewable energy by 2035, and of course it'll be 100% by 2050. So that has been delivered. We're just going to talk you through that. Renewable heating, we appointed a company called GemServe, who've been absolutely fantastic. They've had a couple of workshops, some of you may have attended those, and they have produced their interim report. Liz again will talk you through that. I've already mentioned about transport decarbonisation and how we need to work for the company on that. Land management, so this will be the plan which provides the roadmap for use of land on the island. We haven't yet procured that, we're still trying to secure funding. And then change and engagement. So this is how we engage the public and what we're doing so that they know what we're doing as an island to get to net zero, but also what they can be doing themselves, because it's always going to be joint action. There's always going to be system change that needs to be done by government and policies that enable that, but at the same time, we're also dependent on the public for making changes in their lives too, and that's probably going to be the hardest part of our job. So I think that is it from me, and I think I'm now handing over to Fiona.
Okay, here we go. Just bear with me 2 seconds. Right, Fiona, can you bring yourself? Oh, look, wow, it works. Amazing.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks, Fiona.
Brilliant. So, yeah, good morning to you all. I'm really sorry I haven't been able to make it in person. I'm, as Ali said, the head of research and development in the team. So I'm looking more at the forward planning, the policy development, and also the evidence base for our climate action. So as Ali mentioned, we've been reviewing our inventory data and the making sure that we fully understand exactly where our emissions are coming from, and that we can measure our the success of our actions through that inventory as well. So that's been quite a big focus of work. In terms of Ali spoke quite a lot about the climate change bill, and that's something that it would be good, and we are planning in the near future to do a lot more awareness raising about what the climate change bill actually means, because it has got a very wide range of new provisions. It's not just a framework for climate action, it's also provides the enabling legislation to deliver the actions we've got in place now, and hopefully the actions that we'll be putting forward in the next few years. So it provides a statutory duty for the government and for public bodies to work towards the 2050 net zero goal. But it also acknowledges the ecological emergency and requires action on biodiversity and ecosystems, and it acknowledges the need for a just transition, as Ali's already talked about, and it also requires us to set an interim target by 2030. Well, it requires us to set at least one interim target, and that's likely to be a 2030 target. And for those of you who are familiar with the work that was done with Professor James Curran and the analytical team a year or so ago, there are a couple of different trajectories, different pathways to 2050 were set out in that had different sort of target points for 2030. So that's going to have to be set as part of by April 2022 as part of this legislation. So in terms of the climate change plan, that's very clearly the need for that to be in place by April 2022 is set out in the bill, and the content of it is quite is set out to quite a high level of detail in terms of what we absolutely have to have in it. So, and then when that plan is in place, there is a clear process of it being reported on every year, and a detailed 5-yearly report on the emissions outcomes of that. So in terms of a framework for sort of accountability, it's quite different from previous climate action plans and so on that we've had. So it really does notch up the kind of the framework for delivery. Could I have the next slide, please? So as this is going to be the first statutory climate change plan that we will be working from next April, it does need to set a good precedent, and it needs to be well evidence-based and understood and supported by stakeholders. So the consultation that we had over the summer, and the engagement that we're continuing with, and that this event is part of, is really important. And it's also acknowledged that this plan needs to be ambitious, and it needs to address difficult issues that perhaps haven't been addressed to date. So in the consultation document, which some of you will have had a look at, that there are issues there that we've asked questions about, and we've proposed solutions or actions that are potentially difficult and controversial, but it's acknowledged that now is the time that we have to start addressing some of those issues. And Lizzie will talk a lot more about this in her section later on, but that we need some rapid progress on the no regret decisions. There are lots of complexities around our climate action decisions, but there are some things that we can just get on with, and we need to get on with those things quickly and start cutting our emissions rapidly. There's acknowledgement that we also need to continue with the research and engagement to develop this plan, and then to start planning, almost immediately for the next plan. So there's that evidence base and the research into the best solutions, and particularly the best solutions for our context in the Isle of Man is going to be really important, because there's so much out there now in terms of international climate change research and solutions, but we need to make sure that we're finding the best solutions for our particular set of circumstances here in the Isle of Man. There's also going to be a need for acknowledging the need for flexibility and the ability to adapt to a rapidly changing situation. So we are in some areas very dependent on what happens in surrounding jurisdictions, and so we have to be able to respond to that, and the legislation allows us to do that with the ability to adopt whole sets of legislation that if we need to, so that we don't find ourselves left behind and then subject to kind of disadvantages because of that. And we also need to be able to respond to new developments in research and in the technologies that are available. And what the real purpose, I suppose, of this workshop is that there is an opportunity in this process to develop jointly agreed objectives with the business community that we can encompass in the 5-year plan, but which we work with more collaboratively, and that's one of the hopes from this session. Next slide, please.
Sorry, it's a bit of a lag.
Okay. It's okay, thank you. So this is the consultation closed on the first consultation on the climate change bill closed at the end of August, and we got over 300 responses from diverse sectors, and really thoughtful and well worked out responses, and we're really pleased with the response that we got. And we, as Ali mentioned, Rose led a whole series of different community engagement opportunities as well. So we do feel like we've been able to reach out to a wide cross section of the community, but there's still more to be done around that. And we're still analysing the results, and a full summary report will be made available, but Lizzie's going to be talking a bit more about some of the key results that are relevant to our workshop today. There will be a second shorter consultation later in the year on a full draft of the plan. So the consultation document that was out over the summer was very much lists of potential actions in the context of what we know we need to do, but the actual draft plan the consultation that was likely to be in November will be much more how the actual plan will look. And so in some ways that will be easier for businesses, for example, to comment on, because it'll be much clearer about how it could impact or benefit your particular sector. So work is now underway to develop that full plan and building on those consultation responses and furthering engagement like this. Next slide, please.
Sorry, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. That's great, thank you. So we really hope that today's session will help in the development of the business section. As Ali mentioned, there is a specific inventory category on business that we really want that to be something that's informed by the reality of your situation. And so it's great to have this opportunity today. We hope that the issues that we discussed today can really be developed, and we can take them away, and that can help inform further climate action, either as part of the current delivery programme or as the plan. And you'll have an opportunity, as I've said, about reviewing the plan further. So that Rebecca and Ali, I've talked a bit more about the different themes, but these main themes that we're going to be talking about a bit more about today, the future energy scenarios that Lizzie will be talking about a bit more, and the renewable heating and energy efficiency. And the funding and finance is obviously really critical, and it's great that Chris is leading a workshop, a session on that later in the morning. And then there's an opportunity at the end for discussing any other issues or opportunities. And I think hopefully this is the start of more of a dialogue on these issues. And it's great that the Chamber have got a specific committee on this, and that we can work together, and so hopefully we can take away as many of these things and respond to you on specific queries or opportunities that you raise. I just should also mention that on the panel who has joined us today is Johnny Platten, who's from the research and development team of within the climate team, and he is an economist, and he has been particularly involved in the development of the revised inventory and has a good insight to that side of things. But also as an economist, hopefully we'll be able to play an active role in this discussion as well. So I just want to flag up that he is in the room as well, but it's a bit difficult when people are virtual. So but thank you so much for the opportunity to work with you on this today, and hopefully much more closely going forwards. That's, I think, my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Just before I bring Lizzie up, we've got some post-it notes. We're going old school with post-it notes and pens. If you've got questions, as people are speaking, questions that you've got that you want to raise, can you write them down on the post-its? You can have more than one. And we're going to stick them up. Now, look, not promising they'll all be addressed today, but it's useful for us to take away questions and understand people's thoughts and areas that they need some answers on. So please just write them down, stick them up on the boards, or just pop your hand, when you've got one, pop your hand up and one of us will grab it and pop it up on the board for you. So Lizzie, just bring Lizzie up. Just give me 2 minutes for the onliners. So I'll switch cameras. Whoop. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the onliners are also posting questions, which I'm copying over. So yeah, I'll keep a note of those as well. Just going to start the video again. There we go.
Bear with me 2 seconds. My eyesight is absolutely shocking, so I'm just going to need to see what I'm trying to speak about. Okay, yeah, we're in the right place. So as Fiona's mentioned, this is going to talk about the preliminary results from the climate change consultation, specifically about energy. We've finished our future energy scenario strategy and have the results on it. So it was the topic we had the most information about to put to the public. And a lot of the key areas that the public were asked on in this consultation fed in directly to some of those results. And so it's been really informative in terms of clear direction going forward for us. And we'll also cover, as a result of the consultation, what potential opportunities there may be for businesses, either small or large on the island, to help us with our journey, particularly for energy. Next slide, please. So we launched our future energy scenario strategy in December 2020. We appointed Ove Arup, who had a wealth of experience in various topics in engineering, networks, market trading, and various different types of technologies that's associated with those. Within our working group, we had 30 experts from across government feeding into that work to help provide island-specific issues into that consultation. And there were within the Arup team over 20 specialists that feed into other areas, for example, the UK energy markets, national grid, and the wider European network. And that's really critical when you're looking at trading opportunities for the wider area. So we had 2 targets for electricity. First was to ensure 75% of all electricity is sourced from renewables. And the second target is to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. And there's some key outcomes. We have multiple videos on. Thank you. There's a lot of videos and content that we have on our website. If anyone wants more detail on the future energy scenarios and specific outcomes of that work, we can share these links with you. I'm sick of hearing my own voice and watching these videos now, but it's more for if you're interested in the detail. We're just going to do a very high level summary and how that relates to the consultation at this point. So key outcomes of that work, importing renewable energy will result in the lowest costs to customers on the island. The interconnector or an interconnector, a new interconnector, is going to be required to provide base load in every possible scenario. That's whether we wanted to become an exporter of electricity or an importer of electricity, we will be reliant on a cable. And that the higher the amount of installed renewable capacity on the island, specifically intermittent renewables, the higher the cost to customers. A lot of that ties into the network cost of balancing these renewables on the island. And we certainly see that with some of our higher end scenarios. And the other outcome was that dispatchable generation sources can actually lead to much lower wholesale costs of electricity relative to the UK. So at the moment, many of you will be aware that the high gas prices across Europe and the world have caused very high costs of electricity in the UK. Whereas on Ireland, we're somewhat protected by that because the dispatchable diesel plant can be run to offset those costs on Ireland. But diesels are not renewable and they have CO2 emissions. So we obviously can't keep that same pattern going. Next slide, please. So this is just a really quick overview of the 5 scenarios that were developed. You can see the differences in capacity that we have across these scenarios, and that capacity relates to how much installed capacity we need on island in order to meet all of our demand. So the lower end scenarios, you can see scenario 1, second column there, has got small quantities of renewables in it. So there's about 40 megawatts of installed solar capacity, 20 megawatts of offshore wind, and some onshore wind as well feeding into that. And key baseload provided by the interconnector, and there is still some dispatchable biomass in that scenario. And that results in a total cost of around £1.49 billion across the whole 29 years. That includes all of the fuel costs, the network costs, all of the imports of electricity. And compared to what we're seeing today in terms of electricity prices, we're expecting that to be an estimated £1,142 per household per year. So if we think about what our current electricity bills are today, we see around £645 per household. That is an increase, but obviously as we start to decarbonise in the future, that total household cost will now include heating and transport as well. So it's not necessarily reflecting a higher cost to customer at the end. As we move towards scenario 2, that scenario has more interconnection capacity. If you think at the moment we have one single interconnector going to England, another interconnector could go to the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland or Scotland to give us that additional resilience and the ability to look into other electricity markets, which could be helpful in the future as well. Because there's higher interconnector capacity, there are much lower network costs in this scenario, and including imports, this scenario comes out at £1.4 billion across 29 years, and a similar cost around £1,100 per household per year in that scenario. Scenario 3, that was the cheapest of all the scenarios, involves some biomass dispatchable generation capacity, refurbishment of the existing interconnector associated infrastructure, so refurbishing the transformers that we have and developing on the connections to those transformers on island and in the UK, and the addition of a new interconnector to make sure we've got enough capacity. Scenario 3 does also have some community scale generation projects associated with it as well. So we are finding that that can help to reduce some prices for customers and result in the lowest cost for customer across at £820 per household per year. So that actually represents a reduction in our household bills per year. Those are the first three scenarios, and the latter two scenarios at the back end have a much greater capacity of renewables. Scenario 4 has almost, well, nearly 10 times our energy needs included in that scenario, and that is still only able to deliver 58% of our energy needs on island. So even with that massive renewable capacity, with 10 times more than we need, it's still not enough to meet our domestic energy use, because the renewables are intermittent. They're not readily available. There will be periods like we've just had where the wind doesn't blow for 2 weeks, and that's what's part of the reason we're seeing very high energy prices at the moment in the UK. Scenario 5 was a scenario we looked at as how much capacity would you actually need to ensure you could meet nearly 100% of emissions from domestic energy production. And as you can see, the scale of what is required to do that is massive. That is to ensure you've got enough storage capacity available for when the intermittent renewables are no longer available. So that scenario resulted in a total spend of 4.5 to 6.1 billion pounds over the cost, so massive scale compared to the first three scenarios we looked at, and represents an increase in electricity prices and energy prices up nearly 3,450 to 4,700 pounds per year. So huge investment.
On scenario 4, it's actually the cheapest electricity. It's just that you put the cost of the investment on the consumers. Is that, if you had a company?
No, that's not correct. It was the cheapest wholesale price, which doesn't necessarily reflect the cheapest electricity price. Obviously, when you pay for infrastructure, regardless of who pays for that cost of infrastructure, if it's private sector or if it's government, the customer still has to pay for it. So if government pay for this asset, then it's our taxes funding the capex, and then we will recover that money from our bills. Whereas if it's private sector paying for it, then that money is recovered by having higher bills to pay for it. And that's something we do have to be aware of, that it's ultimately going to be the residents of the island paying for it.
Unless it's similar to the UK and Ireland.
And we're just going over where we kind of started the RF process, which is the fundamentals of future energy, the energy trilemma. The trilemma has 3 key areas. So the first is affordability of electricity. We have some customers today are on the fuel poverty line. They do struggle with prices. It's really important for the just transition that we remember these people. We don't want a situation where we increase electricity prices in a way that means they are left behind and struggling even more with their electricity. So that's a really important area. We have a security of supply. At the moment, our electricity is very stable. We have an interconnector that can meet capacity, the CCGT that can meet capacity. We have additional diesels on island that can meet capacity. So that's actually 3 assets that can all provide our island's demand when we need to. And as we move to the future, it's important to retain that level of security of supply. It's really important to our businesses on island. And the third aspect is the environment. So climate change, obviously CO2 emissions feeds into that area of the environment, but there are other issues as well. So how much impact does the installation of a particular plant have on the environment directly? And that doesn't necessarily mean climate change. And we framed the consultation around these outcomes. So we did look at the RUC report, but we also fed in what was the most important aspect of the energy trilemma to residents on the island, because that will affect which pathway we ultimately go down. Next slide, please. So the first question was tailored around security of supply. So I mentioned we've got really good resilience at the moment. That was important to attracting a lot of our businesses onto the island. And the outcome is that most respondents for the consultation were not willing to accept a lower level of resilience, even if it meant that we were going to see a reduction in electricity costs in the future. But respondents were willing to accept times when power may be limited. So that's quite important in terms of future tariffs. So we'll just quickly go over the opportunities associated with limiting power. Thank you. So this is an opportunity tailored to the businesses we already have on the island, which is demand side shifting. So that doesn't, at the moment, what we tend to do with electricity is we generate to meet demand. Well, demand side shifting looks at changing the way demand is to make sure that generation is more stable. So if you think of the smart devices we have in our homes that's starting to come in, can we make these perform better? Can we have a situation where, for example, your new heat source will take electricity off the grid at periods when there is very low demand to try and increase that electricity demand that we're seeing from the generation side? And can we use it to store heat so that when you come home from work, rather than using electricity to generate that electricity, that source of heat, can you just release heat from something you've stored earlier in the day? And I think that there's a lot of businesses in Ireland that the Internet of All Things that tie in really well with that. We do have these, the capability and the expertise on Ireland to really help with this area. And if you look at what's happened around the world, many countries have rushed ahead and installed renewables as quickly as possible, but then they've had this issue with this demand imbalance. So the periods when we don't have wind tend to be very expensive. Well, what if we change that so we use the power when we've actually got wind? That's the first opportunity. Okay, next slide, please. So the next set of questions were related to on-island generation and how important the aspects of the trilemma are to residents. So the respondents believe that all aspects of the energy trilemma are equally important. So if we're thinking of our scenarios, which is the most balanced in providing those aspects. Interesting conclusion from the consultation is that local on-island generation is actually not that important to residents. They'd rather just see the lowest cost of electricity. And if that is importing electricity, then that is what our residents seem to want. Some respondents were willing to pay slightly more for electricity generated from an island renewables, but they don't want everyone to be affected by that. So having an option for tariffs to allow people to pay more if they want to use renewable power might need to be considered in the future. But it's really important to recognise that there is a substantial amount of respondents on that, while it wasn't the majority, that were absolutely not willing to accept any increase in their electricity prices. So we do need to remember that that is quite a significant portion of people on the island, at least in terms of response. We also looked at how rapidly we could reduce emissions. And we know that the fastest way to do that is to start importing electricity right now. The import of renewable electricity from the UK was on the whole backed, but it's important to remember that the UK isn't always generating its electricity from intermittent renewables, and we're seeing that at the moment. It's just put the coal stations back on. So at this period of time, it wouldn't be the right decision to import if we wanted to have greener electricity. So we also had some feedback that residents were supportive of reducing the electricity produced by the CCGT for export, and not a significant amount either. So there isn't a desire to see a massive reduction in emissions instantly if it's going to end up costing more money, but people were willing to see a slight increase in prices. And the graphic at the bottom is an option for how we might go about that scheme. So Ofgem in the UK offer what's called renewable energy guarantees of origin, which means your electricity must be sourced from a green source across, and we can potentially have an agreement with the UK that means we're sourcing our electricity from these sources across the UK, and we can trade that through the interconnector on days where these renewables are available, so that is an option. Next one, please. So the next opportunity for businesses is how we can decarbonise in terms of electricity. So we do already offer a green tariff on Ireland to businesses, not necessarily well advertised. And that utilises electricity that's created in Solvay Hydro. We currently do have capacity on that green tariff to allow businesses to take up that electricity use if we want to use that. So you need to speak to Manx Utilities if that's something you're interested in. But the more people who start to insist that they want their electricity to be green, the more we have to adapt and make sure we do actually have enough electricity to accommodate that. So this is where those renewable guarantees of origin comes in, because at the moment our renewable capacity on Ireland is limited. So we would either have to build more renewables on Ireland to meet that obligation, or we have to import renewable sources from the UK. So that comes about with a higher uptake of this green tariff. Next slide, please. And another opportunity framed around the same bit would be that if residents aren't willing to accept an increase in electricity, but businesses still want to decarbonise, then there is a solution that means residents aren't affected by businesses decarbonising, and that is for businesses to go off grid. So having renewable electricity on business will allow you to decarbonise instantly, but it doesn't then affect residents by increasing their balancing costs and network charges. So that's something we can do now. And there's an example of how that worked just on that graphic, which is renewable technology backed with storage and backed with alternative dispatchable options for when that power isn't available. And there's some quite good examples around the world of where this is already happening. Okay, next slide. So touched on dispatchable generation, which decreases the overall cost of electricity in periods when we either can't source it from storage or from intermittent renewables because they're simply not available. Touched on the example in the UK, 2 weeks worth of not having any wind at all means we're not going to have storage in those periods, even if we use wind to store that energy, it will be gone by this point. So there was support for dispatchable biofuel generation, quite a high level of support for it actually, but it's important to recognise that there were concerns raised about how it can be sustainably sourced. So we know we can sustainably source biofuel on Ireland. We know we can make 30,000 tonnes per year, kilotons per year, sorry, from solid biomass, so that's the plantation wood we have available, and that's already been set aside for making biomass for a renewable heating strategy that was done back in 2009. But there are alternative ways of generating biofuel. So Miscanthus has seemed to be an option across in Europe at the moment, which is a really rapidly growing energy crop. There is a lot of interest in biofuels produced from algae, making oil. And there are still options for making sure that's done sustainably. There wasn't a keen desire for residents to see biofuels imported to the island. So that does limit us to what the outcomes of the RF work was, because they did limit that capacity to 30,000 tonnes per year of use in their scenarios. So we know we can meet that, we just can't increase it if we wanted to really work in on that opportunity, unless we can generate more. Next slide, please. So next opportunity for businesses would be biofuel production. So we've mentioned we do already own as a government plantation stock, but there are opportunities potentially for the agricultural sector where we can grow energy crops. But you know, we have to be aware that there are some disbenefits of that as well, that that could be replacing the food crops. And certainly as we start to see climate change working on the island, there is a potential that some areas we currently use for growing food crops are no longer going to be available to do those. But they may be able to grow alternative energy crops. We also have quite a high level of biotech firms, I believe, on Ireland who may wish to investigate the potential for production of bioliquids from algae. So this is an example of an algae biofuel farm in the middle picture there. And the last picture refers to biogas production, which we could do by anaerobic digestion. It's quite a large amount of seaweed that we have on Ireland, and that's another potential option. But for each of these things, the sustainability is crucial. If it's not sustainable, it's not going to achieve carbon neutral generation. That's a finding of the IPCC report 2018, chapter 2, on biofuel specifically. It acknowledged it can be carbon neutral, but the sourcing has to be sustainable or it doesn't meet that objective. Maybe one of the surprising things from the consultation is that the majority of respondents supported retaining public sector ownership of generation assets. That's quite a strong feedback from some respondents on that. They do wish to see generation owned by the private sector. The key thing from that is that comment obviously applies to centralised grid networks. So for the residents don't want to see private ownership, but that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities for the private sector in terms of selling electricity straight to the UK, as long as it doesn't affect the residents of the island. And we are looking at those options in other strategies. Thank you. So it's just going to give you a quick overview of the renewable heating strategy, which we've only just had the results through. It wasn't really featuring in the consultation, didn't have the strategy available. So we appointed GemServe to lead the island's renewable heat strategy. We were quite insistent that we wanted to see a fabric first approach. So increasing the efficiency of the building means that you don't have to use as much energy when you're heating it. So that ties in also to what ARUP have predicted in terms of future energy production and use and demand on island. GemServe have looked at 72 different building archetypes across the island. So these are both businesses, government buildings, and residents as well. And that's quite important to make sure that we are recognising that there isn't a one-shoe-fits-all for every building. There are options that are currently suitable for modern buildings. Right now, like air source heat pumps can be used. The properties are very well insulated, whereas trying to put an air source heat pump in a very old mudstone cottage, which hasn't been insulated, is probably not going to be able to deliver that heat that we enjoy from oil at this point in time. But by insulating these properties, we can start to change the way we use heat. Next slide. So these are the sort of overarching outcomes from the renewable heating strategy. And as I've mentioned before, there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There will be exceptions in each of these areas, but this is the general trend. So for very old buildings that are poorly insulated, where the cost of insulating that building to significantly reduce emissions is way too high for most people to be able to afford, a standalone biofuel boiler is probably going to be the option for those buildings. As we start to improve efficiency and move to the more sort of medium properties, middle-age properties, we might be able to insulate quite cost effectively, but still not massively increasing the amount of energy efficiency. And these buildings are probably going to be suitable for hybrid heating systems. So that's a combination of something like an air source heat pump, or specifically a ground source heat pump seems to be favoured by GemServe in tandem with a biofuel boiler. So what does that mean? We would use our air source heat pump or ground source heat pump constantly across the year, but in winter that would be subsidised by the biofuel generation, because the air source heat pump isn't going to be able to deliver enough heat to meet all our heating demands in winter, but it would reduce the biofuel use. And the third option, which I touched on already, is for buildings that are very well insulated already, don't need much greater insulation in order for them to be able to accommodate heat pumps in the future. So standalone heat pumps will be an option for some properties on the island. Most properties on island are going to be suitable for the hybrid heating system. And the last interesting outcome from the GemServe work is that actually district heating schemes for any one of those buildings sets is going to be quite useful if you happen to live in a highly densely populated area which has got high heat demand already. So GemServe carried out GIS work and fed in our current heating use to identify spots that use quite a lot of heat. So as you can imagine, the towns and Douglas in particular is a real heat spot. So that's where you've got tightly packed houses and they're all using heat in a dense area. What is a district heating scheme? Well, that would be a massive standalone unit, potentially, like a large-scale ground source heat pump, and the heat from that facility is then transported into various different buildings. Ramsey, as an outcome, has one of the greatest opportunities for renewable heat in district heating, and that's just because of a lot of the new builds that are going on and how they're set up, using a lot of heat in small area. There were 25 areas that are potentially suitable for district heating across the island, and 11 of those happen to be in Douglas. That sounds like we might be building a large-scale sort of biomass unit to share the heat, but actually some of the energy efficiency side would lead us to capture waste heat. So some businesses, like data centers in particular, dairy businesses, the breweries have quite a lot of waste heat. And rather than at the moment using a lot of electricity to try and cool this down or eject it from the building, capturing that waste heat means we can actually reduce the energy usage and use that, convert it into heating use to supply buildings. So, thank you. So that's the last opportunity that we've recognised, and that is district heating, specifically for businesses that do have really high cooling loads at the moment, capturing this waste heat and then using it to supply residents. And that's particularly interesting if we do have businesses that have gone off grid, because at the moment, that's going to be quite a heavy investment in terms of capex when businesses do go off grid, but the renewable heating and the waste heat capture side will allow businesses to recover some of that initial investment by selling the heat from the waste side to residents. And it can result in much cheaper heating bills for residents as well. And that's us. Sorry for the very quick overview there. I'm just going to bring Fiona back up in case we are.
So, okay, well, thanks. First of all, huge thanks actually to Lizzie and Ali and Fiona for taking us through such a lot of information so quickly. I mean, that's great. I'm sure lots of questions are being scribbled down on post-it notes or on the chat on Zoom call. So, and obviously we've had a few come through, but I think probably if we can start gathering some up, and then the team can start to feed some of the things from the board through, perhaps pull together, where people have really very similar questions and trying to. I think obviously once we've got the team here, then different people are coming on with different questions. But a couple of things just to kick us off. There's a couple of things I'd quite like to pick out from the presentation we've had. And the first thing I'd like to do is to just, on the future energy scenarios, I think there was a point that Lizzie made, which I thought was really worth us trying to pull out a little bit more. Because in the future energy scenarios, the cost compared with the 640 whatever it was pounds, the average electricity bill at the moment, all of those electricity bills were much higher. But the point Lizzie made was that, of course, that's a total energy cost rather than just the electricity bill. And for most, in almost any future energy scenario, and certainly any decarbonisation scenario, the emphasis is going to be a move to electrification, because by electrifying transport, electrifying heating and so on, that allows you ultimately to benefit from decarbonised electricity, which is so there's a big shift there. It's almost inevitable to the focus being on decarbonising electricity, driving the decarbonisation of other sectors because they're also electrified. And so, and I know from my own personal experience of this, is that I have quite high electricity bills. I built a house a little while ago. We insulated it well, we put in a heat pump, we drive electric cars. And if I look at my electricity bills, they're quite high. If I remember that I'm not paying for any petrol, I'm not paying for any oil, I'm not paying for any gas at all, then suddenly my electricity or my energy bill is really, really low. And I think until people start to, and this is one of the challenges in any financial understanding of this kind of thing, is you've got to be able to make a comparison which cuts across the current cost silos, okay? Because they're not, because they're different. And so, and I think that if there's, I've got one ask really, in terms of, and this applies to some of the work that GemServe have done as well around district heating, for example, is it needs to be seen in terms of in the context of the total energy cost per household, rather than the specific cost of the current way we do things, because it may not be the same category. And I think that we've had some questions from the on the chat already from some of the business members of the committee actually around planning and around. There's one particular question came in from somebody who was very helpful actually from Campbell Kessler, whose business is very energy intensive, and talking about what planning, how does he know, or what information can we give about future energy costs, future electricity costs, to allow him to plan whether or not he's going to stay on the island, and this is one of those things, or whether he needs to plan to move elsewhere. And I think I'll put Lizzie on the spot on that one in a minute, a little bit. But I think one of the things that really has to be taken into account there is that it's a more complicated question than anybody can possibly answer right now, because nowhere is going to have, everywhere in the world is having the same conversations, and everywhere in one way or another has the same trilemma, okay? And ultimately, technologies are changing. The demand for green energy is only going up, because as a business, from my point of view, running a business which also uses quite a lot of power, I also know that for the vast majority of my customers, which are often public sector customers in the UK and beyond, I'm going to be put under immense pressure to prove that our product, which is actually, which is IT and software services and so on, I need to be able to prove that it's carbon neutral anyway. And so actually it will be irrelevant whether it's slightly more expensive or not, because I won't be able to sell it unless it's carbon neutral, and I will pass those costs on. So it's not such a simple question. I mean, looking back, it's not just about cost in an absolute sense. It's about ultimately your ability to comply with the expectations of your customers to deliver a clean product. So I think and that in itself will change the economics. So we're in a situation where it's actually very hard to say that to think about things purely in terms of current cost and current categories of cost. So, and that then brings me to the final point I wanted to make from all of this, which is that for anybody making decisions, you need to be able to understand the running costs, the lifetime costs, rather than just the capital costs. Because from my own personal experience, if you're looking to decarbonise, for example, in a residential context or in a business context, you're going to be looking at high capital costs, but you're also looking at low running costs. And so the actual cost equation has a different time frame than perhaps we're used to thinking in terms of. And I think that's really, really important for government. Again, I'd like to put a question to Ali on that one, which is really to what extent, and perhaps to John as well as the economist in the room, if he's in the room, and which is online. So which is all about whether or not the way in which government is looking at these questions in terms of its own investments is as holistic as it should be, and whether we're looking at lifetime cost and looking at cutting things and also looking at cross categories rather than simply trying to make direct comparisons with companies. So Lizzie, do you want to just pick up on that point about about whether or not people should be fleeing the island because on the basis of the fact that we're going to have very expensive electricity.
Okay, so very expensive electricity is an interesting term. The UK wholesale price is actually in all of the ARC models predicted to be slightly higher than the island's wholesale price for electricity. We did touch on this. Is the real key the key point from the ARC scenarios is that dispatchable generation availability. So if we have a controllable source of power that we can flick on anytime we want, it doesn't rely on having the wind available, it doesn't rely on there being solar available to charge, or even having a storage facility available where that has been charged in the days before by wind. As I touched on, 2 weeks worth of having no wind at all is not going to help. If you've got storage, it might last a couple of hours, but it's not going to get you through full 2 weeks. So in scenarios which do have storage capacity without that dispatchable generation available, that's where we see the high electricity prices. Where we do have the dispatchable facility available, if the UK prices are expensive, we're protected from that high import cost because the dispatchable units are running and offsetting the high cost from the UK. And they're only economically viable to run in these periods of very high electricity prices from the UK. So highest price we've seen this week. And bearing in mind the average price for electricity on Ireland currently is down £30 to £35 per megawatt hour. The UK has been hit by £4,000 per megawatt hour this week. And that's why it's been economically viable to run the diesels. So having a biomass generator, which is slightly more expensive than current electricity prices at £98 per megawatt hour, is ultimately going to result in reduction of electricity prices if you averaged out that wholesale price of electricity. And that's what the ARC models have shown. So yes, electricity may be more expensive, but it's looking like in every scenario it's cheaper on island because of that undercutting of the UK market. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay.
So I think, and I've been told that I sound a bit like gravel and bucket on the chat, so I'm going to try and raise my voice a little, speak a little louder. But but I think what I certainly took from Lizzie's presentation was that there is no, in current plans, there is no sort of drive towards a very high energy comparative scenario here for the island. I think there is probably, and I think there probably are some views around the floor, I think there are a lot of opportunities around renewables which are likely in the future, which are not necessarily taken into account here because they don't relate specifically to the island and the island's emissions and so on. And I think, but they may relate to the island's renewable assets, which are very, very significant. And I think another point that I'd like to kind of, and perhaps I don't know if there are any questions being collected around the floor, but the idea of no regrets decisions is very important because putting in additional interconnectors makes us part of a much wider energy marketplace, means that we can come up with these scenarios which don't ultimately reduce our resilience or massively increase our costs. But of course, what they also do is they protect us from potential or retain the potential to exploit some of our assets, our renewable assets in the future for export. And I think that the other thing, another question I would like to actually ask, whilst I'm waiting for some of the questions from the floor, is what are the barriers or what are the views, if you like, to on significant investment in offshore wind energy in the Irish Sea that's connected indirectly to the UK or European markets? Is that something that's been considered at all in this, or is that a potential investment opportunity?
Okay, thanks, Chris. So the future energy scenarios work purely looks at domestic use and generation on the island. If you want to export electricity and you have a large offshore wind farm and you want to bring that electricity to the island, then we have to put massively more or spend much greater cost on network infrastructure to be able to accommodate it. So, for example, Mike's probably going to chew my ear off at the end of this meeting, but we have a 33 kV network at the moment across the island, whereas systems that can accommodate 800 megawatts of wind will probably need to be upgraded to at least 132 or 400 kV, and that's a massive infrastructure cost. So that isn't, if you want to then sell electricity from that source, it's going to be more expensive. And the other issue with anything on island or brought to the island is we currently have a really high uplift cost relative to the UK. That's because we transport materials across from the UK. We have UK supply chains. We are very much tied into what the UK are doing, but we then have to pay extra on top to bring it over to the island. The cost that was used in the ARUP models was at the time correct, was which is 11%. So that's showing that we couldn't have exported for the most part in a lot of the ARUP solutions. That uplift cost on island is now 20%. So it's increasing. We're expecting for large scale capex costs that to go even further to 25%. So that means if you have constructed something that's the same price as a UK technology with an extra 25% on top, it's not going to be competitive with things they're doing in the UK. At the moment, and the UK is moving very rapidly. So by 2025, the UK will be a net exporter of wind, and by 2030, it's going to increase that tenfold. So they're estimated 100 gigawatts of wind capacity by 2030. But they've already done the network infrastructure upgrades to accommodate that. So that's the barrier technically why we have an issue with anything being brought onto the island. Now, in terms of exporting directly to the UK, so having an offshore wind farm with a cable that feeds straight into the UK network, that technically isn't a barrier. That's great because the UK soaks up all of our network costs, and the UK, we also don't have to see that big uplift because there's already floating flotillas that construct offshore wind farms already around us. It's not going to represent a higher increased cost. But we do have financial barriers at the moment. So one of these is the contracts for difference. It's spoken about quite a lot. At the moment, there's potential consideration that we may be allowed into that scheme in the future, but the UK hasn't been pushing for that at the moment. It's not seen as being in their immediate interests. They have a lot of their own offshore wind providers who want to sell them electricity. So there isn't that immediate push or need for them to allow us into that scheme. That CFDs are a market opportunity. That means it's competitive and it gives wind operators quite a good I suppose, gives them low risk in terms of selling electricity, and it also ties into things like constrainment costs. So if there is too much wind capacity, you can be paid as an operator to turn off your wind farm. So that's why it's quite important. And Ørsted, who have already committed to putting a wind farm or have already shown interest in building a wind farm in our waters, have said they need that mechanism to be available to them before we can actually export directly to the UK. In the future, there will be alternative contracts likely, so different versions of PPAs that may become an opportunity. They're not currently competitive, but that may change. There's also things like multi-interconnectors where you can connect your offshore wind hub into other offshore wind hubs and then sell it as a big conglomerate to the UK. And what seems to be the biggest economic opportunity in terms of just exporting is to have a floating offshore wind farm with a floating storage facility that then sells directly into either the UK or European market. So having an offshore hydrogen production facility, for example, doesn't come onto the island, so we don't need to pay for the infrastructure, but then that is sold directly to European markets. So we can still play our part as in the global market in terms of reducing global emissions. It won't affect our island emissions to do that, but it will be more significant than trying to bring that onto the island and also result in better costs for customers.
If you don't mind, just jumping back to your earlier points about capital costs and cables and interconnectors. I know it's before your time, but do you know why we didn't speak to West of Link about looking into the Isle of Man when it came past this a couple of years ago? Our costs of about 200 million quid to bypass the Isle of Man.
Was this for the interconnector?
There's an interconnector that goes from Scotland to Wales and it bypasses the Isle of Man. deliberately?
I believe
At
we were
great
offered the
cost, is that right?
opportunity. And I'm not sure why it wasn't taken. Someone from Manchester Utilities might be able to answer that question. Ultimately, at the time we built Forest Power Station, though, if we had gone down this sort of what is the cheapest solution for the island, at that point, interconnector would have been the cheapest solution for the residents as well. It's become competitive more recently because the UK's adopted carbon tax and the Clean Air Act, and it's then costing them more money to produce electricity from gas in the UK than it costs us. But that's very much a policy decision that's allowed us to. If the UK was on the same platform as us and didn't have these, there wouldn't necessarily be that export opportunity for us.
That's very interesting. So what we're actually saying is we can sell competitively because we have lower standards of environment, essentially, is what we just said, which is quite an important point to just call out, because it's not necessarily something which is a sustainable advantage if they look at the quality of the supply. And I think that's, but I think the very interesting point being made here, can you just, so what we're actually saying, if I've heard right, is that the opportunity came up to actually, for it to be cheaper to put an interconnector between Scotland and Wales, but we made it more expensive for them to the tune of 200 million by not letting it come across the island. Is that what you
I don't know if
said?
we did it or not, but it certainly, I think, was an opportunity missed.
That's very interesting. Dave?
No, just one thing that's not often brought up is, of course, Ireland is also struggling with on the knife edge with its power generation. Talking about going to France, we straightforwardly outline the link to Europe, if and when, of course, Ireland is Europe, but also to get into the European market via Ireland, which is the same distance. So
just to correct you on that, it's not straightforward, and that's because we have to comply with grid codes. So at the moment, we're tied into national grid. We use those grid codes. With the European market, that's a totally different issue altogether, and that makes things much more complicated in terms of our network balancing and how we trade electricity. It's not cut and dry. And Ireland has obviously invested massively in offshore wind. They're in the same position as EDF. They're increasing that capacity. Where they struggle is that base load, and that's why they're going into France to benefit from nuclear.
The question is a separate one, but in terms of the target, 75% by 2025 is quite an aggressive target. Has it been modelled as to what would be the cost differential if that were deferred by 10 years? So 75% by 2045.
So ORIC didn't look into that because that's not an option. We have that set in stone.
But surely it feels to me going to be very expensive to achieve that. And by doing it a little bit more naturally than organically, that it would actually cost the island a lot less in the winter.
So, because the scenario showed that actually scenario two is cheaper than the status quo.
Yeah, so the status quo of continuing to keep our assets in terms of maintenance costs, we've provided maintenance costs for it, but actually the projected future increases in fuel costs is really important. We're seeing today, if we'd have modelled it, if ORIC had modelled gas prices at the time and just projected those into the future, it would have made gas look great. Today, £4,000 per megawatt hour is not competitive in terms of gas, and that level of gas uncertainty is probably going to become worse in the future, and we're already seeing that the issue at the moment is ultimately a result of climate change related impacts in South America and China, and that can only become worse as we're not going to stop climate change over the next 30 years. So we are going to be hit by these higher gas prices, and it's in our interest to move away from that as quickly as we can.
Can I just add to that as well? So you had mentioned the interim target, which probably by 2030. And given that energy is 33% of our emissions, it's probably going to be that's the area we have to focus on to get to that.
I do get that. We're committed to providing value for money. So surely these studies should at least be done so that we can make a decision on a rational basis rather than one which just kind of feels wrong. So maybe 2035 is perfectly economically viable, but nobody knows.
I think it's an interesting question, and it's entirely what I was looking for in terms of what other information we could want. But I think having looked at some of the work in quite a bit of detail in terms of what the assumptions were, I mean, there are some things which is talked about, for example, the export opportunities, which are clearly not part of that analysis. So that's a different area of business. But one of the really important factors here, I think, is that the current CCG team will essentially come out of the picture. And given we all know how much was spent on building that plant, and also perhaps the question before about mitigating, and maybe that was a rather poor economic decision by any, with the benefit of a great deal of hindsight, obviously. I think the fact that that is a very hard date that's part of these calculations makes them, which happens to coincide with the dates on climate change, means that those set scenarios, that 2035 scenario seems like a very sensible point in time to take, because otherwise you end up with them, whether you look at 2045, 2040, 2030, you could almost have an infinite number of different time frames. It does seem that that's quite a, because it avoids a very large reinvestment in current technology at that point. That seems like
I think some of those assumptions are incorrect. So I think it'd be really worthwhile exercise. I'm not saying 2035 is wrong, just saying I think there are some of the assumptions which perhaps could be improved. So I think it'd be really worthwhile doing a financial analysis just to prove that we're going to be spending $500 million, that we spend it in the right way at the right time.
I think that's the whole point of the analysis, and so I think any feedback on, because one can do an independent analysis, but if there are specific points around assumptions and timeframes and those other things which people want to challenge or effectively rerun, then I think that's a valid thing to put forward. So
just to make sure that we're absolutely the right thing and get everyone's attention.
It's just a quick point to come in on Chris made in terms of the export opportunities. ARC did look at export opportunities for electricity that we've generated on Ireland, and that uplift cost is what makes it uncompetitive with the wider European market. And obviously, if we're seeing a 20% uplift cost on the 11 that they use in the model, it actually becomes worse. But we didn't look at direct exports to the UK markets from offshore wind. So that I just wanted to clarify that. Direct wasn't considered, indirect was considered, because it does affect the local island network.
The thing is, the Isle of Man has world-class resources when it comes to wind, shallow sea, it's got magnets, it's got all it needs for to be completely zero carbon when it comes to power generation. I think that's the objective. We should be producing low carbon, low cost electricity on island and finding a way to export it. That's what's been looked at as really the cheapest way to do it, and that's not necessarily the best. I think it's an investment. You should be looking at that.
I think one of the comments I'm naturally, but personally, very much aligned with that point of view, because I know there's a huge, and particularly wind energy resource on that that's at a very high level, and also I think from a technical point of view, it is the case that the average wind speed is very high, and the relative value of the electricity produced goes up exponentially with average wind speed rather than linearly. So because of that, some of those uplift costs, which are a linear increase in cost, aren't necessarily that big a problem. But ultimately, like anything else, there has to be a business case made, and I think that I think there's always a trade-off, or there's always a conflict between a sort of simple assessment of opportunity or resource and the cost of utilising that economically. And I think that one of the things that's going to be a really, really important thing that none of us can really understand right now or be sure about is how quickly the economics of storage are going to change. And I think that's a really, really, really important point that we all need to acknowledge. Storage is almost like the big unknown in this. And storage isn't just about, for example, current major big battery installations, or even about pump storage. It's just about pump storage and pump hydro. And bear in mind that the UK is investing a huge amount of money in cables to Norway, so they can pump water up hills using excess wind energy. And that network effect is one that we're very familiar with in things like in digital industries, for example, where getting the world connected up, the data has been a huge infrastructure cost that's just happened over the last 20 years, which enables all sorts of industries which didn't even exist when we started that process. So I think there are a lot of things going to happen which we don't know about yet. And I think that comes right back to the no regrets aspect of this. And certainly from my point of view, I can see lots of things which are definitely look like assumptions which may be proved wrong, but I can see very little. And I'm really interested if anybody strongly disagrees with this point. But I can see very little which says that connecting up to the UK and European markets is a bad idea in order to give us maximum ability to exploit our assets in some way, and also to maintain and respond to the stuff in the consultation and from Helmut and others, which says we kind of want to be sure that we're not going to be really an outlier in terms of electricity costs that makes, that causes us major problems for our businesses overall, in terms of dual property or whatever else. I don't know. Did you have any other comments?
Well, I agree completely. Just about the other point you make, additional connections gives you more resilience, which is something that people missed on the other map. We've got a very secure electricity supply system for the last couple of decades, and that's absolutely key to business. We've got power cuts left, right, centre, people believe additional cable connections can only improve that no regret carbon costs.
Okay, so does anybody have any other comments or questions on it? Does anybody think this is all missing the point? Is it?
Just maybe it's a workshop question, but how far does the ability, the grid that we could buy renewable energy from, how far abroad does that go? Go past the UK? Are we interconnected to be able to buy renewable energy from Europe, for example?
Yeah, so that's part of that REGO's obligation that Ofgem can use that to trade from the European markets as well. So on days when they don't have wind produced in the UK, we can import it from the wider market.
So it's a balanced system. So you buy electricity here and they give it to us there.
Yeah, but in terms of our direct connection, we only have a direct connection to GB at this point in time.
This is 62 megawatt cable that's there today?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So from what I hear, the idea or the solution you're coming up with here is that we will buy renewable energy and then buy carbon credits, for example, to make up the rest of the carbon envelope. Is that it?
No, so this is just looking at electricity. Building an additional interconnector means we can import greater than 60 megawatts in terms of renewables. So it's not a carbon credit exercise, it is specifically using that trading. Remember, the UK has also got a 2050 target, and they have got a massive commitment to increase their renewable capacity. 100 gigawatts by 2030 is huge. They are investing heavily in storage technologies at the moment. They've also done away with all of their planning regulation for pumped storage, and they've got a commitment to have 5 schemes, large-scale schemes in place by 2030, and because of the lack of planning regulation now, they're going to be able to build those really quickly. So they've identified 5 sites. They will be built within the next 9 years.
I think it's the reason why we don't have wind towers in Manx waters is simply because, as Ørsted came up with, we don't have a subsidy system or the ability to supply away. And one of the biggest problems in wind energy is curtailment times. When the wind is blowing, the local utility doesn't need the energy. And so there has to be a cyclical type based system where you would use that, as they're trying to do, what England's trying to do with Norway, is try and bring that, say, okay, let's continue to turn those wind turbines, but let's produce hydrogen, or let's produce DME for the ferry, or something like that. And that's why I just wonder if it's a good strategy to say, let's do everything off island, buy everything off island, when we could actually have a business that does that particular production of hydrogen in the curtailment times. That makes it profitable. We're never going to see Ørsted come into these waters unless they either have a subsidy or some way of using their curtailment time. I mean, you saw the last wind energy licenses that were bought in January last year. They were all bought by BP. And Ørsted didn't even participate. So they're feeling insecure that they're actually going to get some subsidies to make their system profitable.
Well, they have just started their impact assessments again and their sort of environmental looking. So they are certainly looking like they're picking up the pace, and that's maybe an indication that they're seeing a different opportunity available to them.
Well, the wind studies were done on the Isle of Man. It has a great wind envelope that comes from the north, goes around back to the south of the island. The best wind sites are on land, but of course it's the Isle of Man. Nobody wants to see wind turbine at the front door, so to speak. But there is a fantastic wind resource of the Isle of Man. It's a special one. It's when you look at the wind charts, it's unbelievable. It's a special.
So it's slightly better than the UK, but
more than slightly better.
Not hugely compared to places like the Republic of Ireland. It's not significantly greater. But what we're talking about with that captured storage and the hydrogen conversion, that as an offshore opportunity for direct export elsewhere is massive. But when you talk about subsidies, who's paying for that? Because that's got to be the taxpayer on Ireland paying for that.
Well,
unless
there's a
we can get
20%
into that.
resource tax to the government now. So if they're producing wind energy, they're getting 20% taxation. So that's an ability for a subsidy. Yeah, I just feeling very uncomfortable with the fact that we're going to be relying on off-island sources for energy security.
We're currently already relying on off-island energy sources for electricity. We import our gas, we import our diesel, every method.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it.
No, but the public who are giving us feedback are not that bothered by, not significantly bothered by it.
Until they can't turn on their lights.
But same
with the Russian embargo a year and a half ago, was it? We were within 24 hours of losing the gas.
I think, but that needs kind of makes the point. I think that kind of makes the point that we just there. I mean, I think I've kind of been thinking about this myself again. This is my perspective on it. Is that the import at the end of the day we import all of our electricity at the moment. It's just as simple as that. Because in terms of because we import the gas, we import the oil, we import electricity and the interconnect. The fact we convert some of those imports of hydrocarbon into electricity on the island doesn't mean it's not imported energy. And I think so I think it's really so I think we need to just be clear cut about that. We import all of our energy, 100% of our energy at the moment. We haven't to import, well, pretty much apart from the hydro and the energy in place, okay. And yes, we could add. From the point of view of the point you're making about the wind resource, I quite strongly agree with that. Because I've done 30 years ago when I first came down, the first thing we did as a business in BMS was work on wind energy and meteorological calculations for both the UK and the Isle of Man, because that was the first generation of wind energy contracts in the UK, and we did work with Power Institute people on the metadata. And the Isle does have a special resource. And the point I made earlier on about the exponential increase in yield as average wind speed goes up is a really important one, because it does mean that having a slightly higher average wind speed means a very much higher energy resource. But notwithstanding all of that, the business, and I have absolutely no doubt that business models for exploiting that resource will become very attractive in the relatively short term. I think it's just about but it is about looking at the storage for be it hydrogen production or whatever else. It's about looking at it holistically. It's not just about raw energy production. It's about energy production and the ability to deliver it to a market that needs it economically. And that's what's going on at the moment, is that whole area is developing really quickly. So
sorry, Fiona wants to jump in as well. Yeah. So
if Fiona jumps in and then there's another
Fiona, go ahead.
It was just a really quick comment, really, to acknowledge some of the questions and points that have been raised. It's just that what Lizzie's presented is a very preliminary assessment of the consultation results. And in terms of certainty for businesses going forward, we hope that in this 5-year plan there will be an element more certainty, but that in the 5-year plan period there will be the opportunity to set dates for making those key decisions, so that by the end of that 5-year period there will be a lot more certainty. But in terms of the actual decision about the outcomes of the energy scenario work, that is ongoing, and that will be a political decision. So just to kind of highlight that in terms of that the decision has yet to be made. So
thanks, Fiona.
Okay, so there was a comment there from the floor.
Yeah, it's just a quick one. It's we're coming back to it, but people don't want and people don't see those things. But because this has only just come through 2019, and they've taken it on. And as we heard from Ali and we heard from Fiona as well, there's a lot more consultation that needs to be done, and we need to. So when we're asking people what do they think, the whole picture isn't known yet. We're right at the start of educating people. So before we can say this is what they want, they need to have a bigger understanding before we build everything up from those answers. Yes.
Can I add to that? There was 300 respondents out of 40,000. Is that considered to be sufficient engagement?
I think that's a very good point. I think I've got a couple of questions may have come from you as well. But,
Sound quite similar.
but I mean, but the underlying point, which again I think, and I'm sure other members of our committee or on the screen probably would too, is the fact that one of the things we all know is that there's a lot we don't know, and obviously the survey, any survey, although it has some weight or has to have some weight in the moment, it cannot possibly be the determinant of what's going to happen for the next between now and 2050 in totality. I think, which brings us right back to the importance of those no regret decisions. I think it also brings us back to trying to make sure that where there are absolutely clear-cut opportunities we can act on, that they are acted on. And I think there's a couple of things I'd like to sort of move us on to there, whilst we're serving the time. And which is one is the question of, I'd like to know a bit more about the district heating stuff, and I'd like us to talk a little bit about current buildings, how current new builds and the standards we're currently building to, and because of the point that came out from the GenStuff stuff about building archetypes and how relatively easy it is when you're building something from scratch to ensure that it is actually going to be a renewable or a renewably heatable resource in the future. And I think it may well be the case that we're still not perhaps doing that as well as our neighbours in Ireland, for example, do, and elsewhere. And whether that's really something we should be waiting till 2025 to change. I think that's a question I'd like to raise. But the other question is, and it's an associated one, which is particularly for domestic scenario, but also in the way that, for example, government looks at its spending decisions. How well or how integrated are we in terms of looking at the way we allow people to finance things like mortgages and other things, to allow them so that they're rational in the context of the total cost of ownership of that asset, rather than simply in terms of the capital upfront cost. Does it make sense to give people higher affordability criteria for a house that's going to cost less to run? I would have thought that made total sense. But so what do we do, or what's the role of government to some extent in showing those economic truths to people in such a way that people who then buy can make rational decisions and justify those decisions, so that people borrowing money can see the value of having a slightly greater investment, a slightly lower or significantly lower cost of ownership, and the people building new homes, for example, can be incentivized to actually build ones by market forces, build ones that are actually going to be much more future-proof and much cheaper to run, because the people are prepared to buy and more able to buy. There's a whole area there where I think we're just missing it at the moment. And I think that's something I'd quite like to kind of get some views on. We shut down the flames by own, but I think it's where business, it's where rewiring the way we currently do business is going to be in everyone's interest.
I think you find most of the major developers in Ireland are just coming up to minimum standards of building control. In most cases, I've got certain customers there who are having houses built, their own houses built, and the builder is literally saying to them, why do you want all this extra insulation, and why do you want all this? And they're saying, well, because I want my investment, my home to be a best quality item, and in the longer term cost me less to run. It's only by legislation can you make the large development companies do that.
Well,
surely, I mean, that's
exactly the point I wanted to discuss and debate. Actually, have people's views on, because I think there are two levers here, aren't there? There's the lever of market forces, and then there's the lever of regulation lifts, and they're both important. But because I've had those conversations too, and I went through the process in designing building house rights myself. It was, if you actually could be bothered to do the sums and could think in long term, it was a no-brainer to do that. It's also going to be a more valuable capital asset if it's in the long run, if it's cheaper to run. But what I think we can ask perhaps, and just in the same way we discussed different scenarios and different parameters for the analysis of future energy scenarios, I would be really interested in some analysis done centrally perhaps by the climate change team around different economic scenarios for different building standards. So something that could be made public. It's just the facts, and I don't think we have that. And I think that's one of the things that people really struggle with, because how do you make decisions when you're listening to a lot of competing claims?
I mean, that was one of my questions here. The building codes, for example, from Norway, they have very eco-friendly building codes. If you did a code to loan system where if here is the new building code that is actually eco-friendly, environmentally friendly, and if you adhere to that code, then the government would sponsor 5% of the LTV of you building that home, thereby giving the banks and everyone else the incentive to be able to say, okay, you can build to the lower codes that we have today, or you can build to these other codes. And if you do that, 5% of your LTV will be sponsored by the government. Not paid by, but sponsored.
So as an underwritten by, you mean?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah, so you pay it back, but if you default, then there's a guarantee.
The government is, yeah.
I mean, those kind of schemes are definitely going to be of interest because most people don't want to default on their mortgage. So, but it's just about, and it's about looking for things which essentially allow the market to move on in ways which already make financial sense. And the barrier of people not having capital, but ultimately paying more in the long run for things is something which I think it needs to be made very visible. And I think that's something that really the climate change team and their advisors have the capability to really help us with. And the same applies with some of those district heating schemes. I think I've heard that this makes a lot of sense economically for individuals. I haven't seen that put in a way which is relatable to somebody who's living in one of those properties and hasn't quite yet. Yes.
So there's a system like that in Bergen, Norway. The waste burning, and they put the heated pipes all over the way throughout the city. I just know that because I own some buildings in Bergen, but it works very well, but it did take quite a while to do.
The renewable heating scheme in the UK started off as a non-domestic scheme, and even domestic district heating schemes were eligible for that. They were built rapidly in some cases, so some of the farms with outhouses that were used for holiday accommodation were done in less than a year. So it can be really quickly. It depends whether or not you want the pipe buried. The from has come up on the chat, and how long has that scheme taken? Well, a lot of it's taken so long is that they've installed I don't want to say channels under the road that will allow things to be fed under the front. So rather than digging up the road, you could feed a pipe through to install.
That's what took so much time in Bergen, was getting the pipes to the place.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so they don't have to dig up the road necessarily. And if you look at Iceland, which has obviously got massive district heating scheme potential from geothermal energy, a lot of their pipework runs above ground. So it's just a different way of thinking. We will have to adapt.
Iceland has a lot more energy, so you don't care.
Oh yes, but they're used to seeing metal pipes as they go along the line. So is it really essential that we bury infrastructure under the road? Gas, probably. We don't want someone to accidentally sever a gas main.
All the stuff in Bergen was buried underneath the ground, and it was very difficult because it's basically they have to blast rock or drill rock. But those technologies of putting those pipes in are been around for the last 30 or 40 years. It's not a difficult task. It just takes time.
I think that it's funny actually. When I was a student a very long time ago in very cold Manchester, we happened to have a flat next to the Heart Lager Group, and we had district heating. Everybody wanted That was a long time ago. It's all been knocked down since. But the point about the district heating stuff is that I think it does sound like it would be a great idea, but it also has the risk of being something that just stays a great idea because somebody has to invest in it. And whether that, or it has to be factored into the planning for the next big Dandara estate or whatever it happens to be. And I think making some of these scenarios, which we're getting great information about and how to, which we've been investing in this early phase of the climate change transformation team work, is bringing some of that work back into a form which makes it really easy to understand and to put into a context, into a domestic or a business context, either as an investment opportunity, or when you're making big investments anyway, or simply from the point of view of to make proper comparisons. So, for example, again, the point about electricity, if you electrify everything, what would be what is the value of electric vehicles as part of dispatchable power system? If we've got smart meters, we've got a smart meter program. These roll out max utilities. Have people being helped to understand that they could potentially be selling electricity back to the grid from their car that happen to be produced when electricity was cheap, either imported cheaply or produced locally cheaply. There's a whole load of scenarios there which are simply not possible because there are too many of them. So it's so smart metering, it's done right, is one of those no regrets type decisions. But if we don't look at transport as part of energy, for example, then we're kind of missing the point again.
Certainly for our transport strategy, it's looking like we are going to need to focus on the energy side of it a lot more. So that will be developed in the long run. We do need to be aware that having a charge vehicle and releasing that electricity to the grid, are people going to be happy that they go to the vehicle in the morning and it's not fully charged anymore? So there has to be a greater understanding, and that complexity will come out of the transport strategy.
Yeah, I think they will depend.
Maybe not if it's flat.
No, but these things are all technical and people can quickly manage and understand if they're in control.
Yeah, thank you. I make sure on the speakers as well. Just a quick question about legislation, really, and the timeline. So what I think I understand is the winter legislation granted from April next year.
Yeah, assessments. June is the pre-winter.
And the consultation will happen from that November, and that's quite a tight, aggressive timescale, 19 months. But also, I think just on that theme, the transport decarbonisation strategy is just in the process of being on. So where does that sit in the timeline for April?
Yeah.
Repeat the question. Really sorry, it really broke up at the beginning.
I was going to, because I'm close to the microphone. So I think just to summarise that, it was really just how realistic are the timescales for getting legislation through in April, first part, and the second part was, and how does the transport decarbonisation element of that fit into those timescales? Yeah.
So, yeah, we've got that commitment to have that plan in place by April. So it is a very tight time frame, and it's obviously it's there's lots of different approvals and processes to go through between now and then. I suppose one of the things that I did sort of acknowledge before is that the plan is likely to be a bit of a hybrid between we want to have as many as possible clear targets, dates that give people the kind of clarity about what exactly is happening, but there's also a lot of work underway still that will inform some of those. So where we can't set those specific dates in this plan, it will be setting dates by which we have to have made that decision, and so it will be this is where it will be a bit of a mixture. And so hopefully in subsequent plans, because obviously we're literally just getting the legislation hopefully in October, and then we have to start enacting it all, so it's been a very tight timescale for everything. But for subsequent plans, then we'll have a much wider kind of set of guidance and a much clearer process in terms of exactly how we plan for that. We make sure that we've covered everything in that process, but because this has been a tight time scale, and there was a commitment, the commitment in 2019 to have the bill in place, it was very ambitious in terms of having primary legislation. So while we want to set a good precedent with this report, with this plan, and do it as well as possible, we are acknowledging as well that it is a learning process and will inform the next one. So, but I suppose in terms of things like clarity on exactly where we're going with the energy and the transport and so on, it's likely to be a little bit of a mix, that there will be some dates that we can set, and then other really key decisions that we have to say we'll have to make this decision within the next year or the next 2 years. So hopefully that, I know it's and because we have got that next set of consultation on the actual plan, and that's where hopefully as businesses it will be much easier for you to see, well, that decision is really going to affect me, and that it, and be able to comment on whether that's too soon or too late, in terms of your decision making as well. So we'd really value your input at that stage. I hope that answers the question.
I guess legislation for me is quite precise, isn't it? I'm not sure that's a very precise answer, but I guess I'm waiting to see.
Okay, thank you. Legislation should be precise in some ways, I think, and permissive in others. But sorry, one more question from the floor, and then I'm going to need to.
So just a quick one on your district heating schemes, and you're saying there are so many options of things to do, and what do we do? I think there are some very good opportunities for some demonstrators. I think we particularly need to get public engagement, and I think if you can get some demonstrator projects going. For example, along the side of the River Douglas, you've got an ideal corridor for feeding heat up and down there without having to bury pipes, and lots of businesses and lots of industrial estates that could potentially tap into those. So there are some excellent opportunities for demonstrators like that. I think if we put some of those things in place, we'll then find out whether in practice they live up to reality, rather than saying, this is what we're going to do, this is our plan, we're going to invest 400 million. Let's get a few demonstrators going as well alongside the strategies, so the strategies can be developed as we learn from these things.
I think that's a really good point, so thank you for that. It was a point that came up as part of the feedback from the interim study last week. The 25 locations that have been identified are the ones that we would have to target, because it depends on the heating density of where you're trying to supply heat to. But the biggest scheme, or a scheme that's quite cheap to do, or maybe a small scale scheme that's being identified within those 25 areas, there's no reason why we couldn't do a feasibility study on one of those. But each scheme will behave differently. It will depend on how much waste heat there is in that area. And I think because it's something new, it's better for people to get their head around it if they can go and see it. So we really need to do it, but the issue is that feasibility study will need to be done for each of those 25 areas before we can progress with one that might be the best choice. And maybe there is opportunity for us to sponsor the initial demonstrator project before others roll out in the future.
It's like 40 megawatts of waste heat available for our station, that will be there until 2035. And so why not have some free energy to the businesses, or to very cheap energy to the businesses along that corridor?
If it's in the area that's been identified, it could be an option, but if it isn't, then it doesn't seem like it's in alignment with the strategy. So I think we need to look at those locations.
It's an interesting point, though. I mean, and I think there's no two ways. There's no doubt that being able to touch and feel something and see and hear people say that they're benefiting from it, that they never believed it with how great it is. That's the most compelling thing for most people. And I think there are quite a lot of things on the island where people have invested in things and learned, and again, making sure we benefit from people's lived experiences is a really important thing. We do need to wrap up, but I think I'm sure there are quite a lot of questions and comments and so on which will be collated anyway by the team, but also I think any ideas either from and this is something I'll be hopefully the Chamber Committee, which will also put some thought and time into, is the scenario. It's being able to take all of that analysis and put it into a context which makes sense for an individual business or an individual household is something which I think is part of that. It's the corollary of what we've just said around the importance of being able to touch and feel something. And I think to try and understand what it would be like for to make some of those transitions based on what we already know is likely to be economic, and to feed that back into the questions about, well, why can't we fund this because it makes sense over its lifetime in that scenario or that scenario. So it's almost like, what's an affordable way to address your particular problem? And for us to look to the team, perhaps, if we can come up with really clear-cut scenarios, which then the data can be used to inform, I think that'll be a really valuable thing for us to do at this stage. So, unless there's anything else really pressing for today, then I'd like. Yes, of course.
Just before I finish, thank you very much, Chris, for facilitating, Rebecca for organising, and I'm very amazed at your AV tech capabilities. It's all seamless. It's very complex, but thank you for the patience of people online. Thank you for attending. We're very keen to engage with local businesses on the island as in our journey to net zero. So we're very much hoping that this type of engagement or some sort of engagement will continue. So after this event, we'll send out a feedback form to see how you felt this event has been beneficial and any ideas how to make it even better. So we'll take that in. Hopefully it will be like ongoing engagement, so we can take some feedback now and we'll bring it to the next workshop. So it's something that we can work on. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Rose, and thank you, everyone. And yeah, hopefully we'll meet again soon.
Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. We've got lots of really good.
Thank you, Rebecca.